There are some difficulties with how religious liberty is discussed that I think make our ability to debate these questions as a society more difficult. Phrases like an assault on religious liberty or a war on religious liberty, which you'll hear quite often from figures like Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum, raise the rhetorical stakes in a way that I think makes it more difficult to have good faith, if you'll pardon the pun, discussions about religious liberty and the very real questions that come up when you're looking at balancing different interests. Even in the case that the Supreme Court decided earlier this year in Hosanna v. Tabor, the court decided 9-0 that it was pretty clear that the questions involved were to be decided on the side of religious liberty and on the side of religious institutions to decide for themselves who qualifies under the designation of a minister or a similar employee. But that doesn't mean that it was useless for that case to be taken all the way to the court. I think the question of how you balance off the rights of an employee and whether that employee should be protected in terms of being dismissed from her job against the rights of a religious institution to get to determine who fills ministerial capacity positions for them, those are serious questions and questions worth considering, not a question that if you posed it to the man on the street would necessarily have an obvious answer. And so again, despite the fact that the court was of one mind on this case, I think it was worth being considered. That said, most of the issues that we've seen in the last year, maybe the last 2 years, I think, have been troubling from the standpoint of people taking seriously the idea of religious liberty. And here I just want to take a few minutes to go through what I think are some of the more negative approaches to this discussion that we've seen. There's no question in my mind that when it came to figuring out a solution to the contraception mandate and the imposition it posed for religious employers, the White House committed a huge unforced error. And certainly if they'd paid more attention to the writings of Bill Galston and Melissa Rogers last fall, they might have been able to save themselves a large amount of grief. But one of the really troubling things for me as I've been covering this issue is to hear all of the arguments coming out of the White House and the White House's supporters that until very recently almost completely ignored the issue of religious liberty, treated it purely as a question of whether we were going to provide contraception to all women. And you would hear many, many times the figures such as, well, you know, 95% of Catholic women use birth control. Ta-da! As if that ended the discussion. And there was a real either complete ignorance of the fact that this was an issue that dealt with religious liberty, or a willful ignoring of the fact that religious liberty was in play. And this was not just a question of access to contraception, which I personally support. But it was, it signaled that this was going to be a debate that was not going to be pleasant because you had, on one side, the White House treating it almost purely as an issue of women's rights. The same could be said, and it's become such a cliche to cite New York Times editorials at this point that I almost didn't include this, except that the editorials the paper has written on religious liberty and on the contraception mandate in the past few months have made the same willful mistake, I believe, refusing to acknowledge issues of religious liberty and focusing, again, only on the issue of whether women should or should not have access to contraception, which I would argue is a completely different issue. It's certainly not the reason that people like E.J. Dionne and Mark Shields and Melinda Henneberger took issue with the administration's first stab at finding a solution on the mandate. But that's not to say that all of the problems have been on the left. Just this morning, I was reading Cardinal Dolan's latest blog post. And again, just as citing my Twitter followers, the fact that I can cite a Cardinal's blog post feels a little odd. But I was reading his latest blog post about his continuing objections to the mandate. And again, was nodding my head at a number of them, but then came to his concern that, among other things, the White House has refused to give proper acknowledgement to the tricky religious liberty issues involved, which I would have some more sympathy for, except that in my memory, the Cardinal himself and the Bishops' Conference in general has not cited at all the concern of women on the other side. And that worries me, that both sides are having a debate where they claim only one kind of interest as valid, and the other doesn't even make it onto the table. I think it's really hard to find common ground solutions in that case when you won't even acknowledge the other rights that are at play. And so I would propose that we get rid of all arguments about who started it and who's most to blame, and instead focus on making sure that when we talk about religious liberty, it's not in a way that trivializes the term. It's in a way that makes it easier for us to take it seriously, both in those places where religious liberty is threatened here in the United States, and importantly, abroad. Thank you.
Thanks.